You've heard the concept of authentic leadership, but do you know what it really means and how you can really live it? That's what we're talking about today. Just part of what we're talking about on this great episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's free weekly e-newsletter, Unleashing Your Remarkable Potential, which is full of articles and resources to help you become a more confident and successful leader. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/newsletter. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You probably already knew that. I am so excited to have my guest with me today. I'm going to introduce him in just a second. We're going to talk about you. I mean, you come here because of leadership, and largely, I assume it's not just to be entertained by Kevin. And so we're going to talk today about us as a leader, and I'm excited to introduce you to Minter Dial. He is an international professional speaker, a multi-award-winning author. He specializes in leadership, branding, and transformation. As an agent of change, he's been a 3-time entrepreneur. He's had 12 different professions. He's moved countries 15 times. His core career stint of 16 years was spent as a top executive at L'Oreal, where he was a member of the Worldwide Executive Committee for Professional Products Division. He's the author of the award-winning World War II story, The Last Ring Home. I'm going to ask him a little bit about that, as well as 3 business books, including Future Proof, Artificial Empathy, and his latest, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. He's been the host of the Minter Dialogue weekly podcast since 2010, when many people couldn't yet spell podcast. He's passionate about the Grateful Dead, paddle tennis, languages, and generating meaningful conversations, which I'm hoping we're going to, there you go. I'm hoping we're going to have today. Minter, welcome. So glad that you're here.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me on. Great to hear.
All right. So we're far apart today. I mean, we're virtually across the table, but we're far apart. You're in France and I'm in Indianapolis, and you've lived in 15 countries. We already know that much. We already know that your journey is interesting and different than probably anyone who's listening. Tell us a little bit about the journey. Like, how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
So first of all, I think we should call this the long distance podcast.
I like it. Let's do it.
Hey, there's a thought. And how did I get here? Well, 56 years old. I have American and French passports and have had this really wonky, long journey. And I suppose if there's a moniker that kind of fits me, as jack of all trades and certainly master of none. I've really enjoyed the exploration of so many different things, whether it was working in a zoo or an aquarium. I did a lot of change in entrepreneurship because most of them failed, but that's also part of change and learning. And maybe the core element of my life has always been around communication. When I was at university in the United States, I studied trilingual literature and women's studies. And in that, I was really interested in this notion of how do you communicate? How do you transmit? And even though I worked in an investment bank and I did all sorts of other things, the core thing that's always been throughout all of my life is communicating and storytelling. So maybe that's how I got to where I got to. Ultimately, I left corporate world when I was at L'Oreal with a need to help other people, liberate them, elevate the debate, and make the world a little bit of a better place than just within L'Oreal.
You call yourself, I've seen that you sometimes call yourself an elevator, and you just use that word. So what do you mean by that? I love that idea as you just hinted at it. So open that door a little bit further.
All right. So when I did my documentary film, I went on they do these festivals, and hopefully you get exposed and maybe even win a prize. So one of them was in Charleston, South Carolina. And I arrived. One funny story is I arrived on the airplane. I didn't have anyone sitting beside me, and it was the first time I was upset about that because I didn't have someone say, "So, sir, what are you doing here?" Well,
I'm here for the film festival.
Festival. But I didn't have a chance to say it. Anyway, bad news. That following morning, jet lag, I got up really early and I went on a run around Charleston. And as I was running around, I saw a big bungee cord, which I put around my waist, and I went running on because it was just lying in the street. And I went running on, and then all of a sudden I saw a big sign that was upside down. I ran over it, and my curiosity got the better of me. And I said, well, what is that sign? What is that sign telling me? And I ran back to it. I turned it over, and it was an elevator sign in the middle of a beautiful park. And I just said, wow, that's crazy. So I ran back home with the elevator and the bungee cord. And I finally said, right, there's something's happening here. And it struck me that I needed to fine tune my North Star phrase to be someone who elevates the debate and connects people, dots, and ideas. And so that the word of elevator really comes from the elevator sign. So it's my moniker. It means something to me, and I'm trying to use it as and helping the idea, elevating the debate in whatever activity I'm doing.
I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. And so two things I want to say to all of you. Notice that the way he used the story to make that make sense. And you don't have to tell a long story for it to be meaningful or memorable. And so thanks for sharing the story and for giving us such a good example, Minter. I really appreciate it. Now, I mentioned it in the intro and you hinted at it just now, but yes, you did create a documentary film after you wrote a book about your grandfather. And you talk about it a little bit in the new book, and we'll get to the new book in a second, but tell us a little bit about your grandfather's story as it relates to the lessons it's created for you.
Well, so I was named after him, and being a branding guy, I guess that's important. You have to know your history. Yep. And really, actually, for brands, when they lose the plot, I feel it's when the founder's gone, the initial intention and verve and risk taking, the founder's story gets diluted more and more. And so I kind of did it for me, and I think it's something that brands should do for them. But I think as leaders, we ought to go back into who we are and find our unique you and be the best version of that that's possible. So that's sort of how I plunged into this journey of my grandfather, who was a Navy officer, United States Navy officer, an academy, from the Naval Academy, and married an actress, my grandmother. And then shortly after having 2 kids, was shipped off to the Philippines, where he won the Navy Cross and became a prisoner of the Japanese for 3 years before being killed as a prisoner. And so I really wanted to explore who he was. And amongst the things that I wanted, well, first of all, I wanted to say thanks to that generation for the stuff they did, the shit they went through, and to uncover the values that they had. Because I think that we live in such privileged times, and a lot of that's thanks to what they did.
Pandemics notwithstanding, by the way, everybody, right? I agree with you 100%.
And things they just didn't need to talk about. They didn't need to talk about me all the time. There was a servant leadership component to the way that they operated. They were at the service of their country. I don't mean to be a patriot in this regard, but this notion of being able to just buckle it up, figure it out, and have that humility not to say it's all about me, and to do it to this bigger cause. And so for leaders, for me, the words there need to taking away the me, understanding what is the greater cause, and be the servant towards that cause. And I think that's what the big takeaway. I mean, outside of that, specifically, my grandfather, when he was captain of the USS Napa in the Philippine Islands, on the night of the 8th of December, 1941, the cook, a guy called John Alexa, who was Polish American, and he's the one who told me the story. He ran in, he was told to, by the man on deck, to run down and wake up the captain. So he runs down to the cabin, wakes up, Captain, you need to go upstairs. The war has been declared. And that's a really moving moment when you're in charge of a bunch of people. And to think about how many moving moments of that nature you have in our life. So he goes and deals with his day, and he goes back to the logbook. And in pen, it was always written by typewriter, but in pen, he scribbles in the side margin, 0340 hours. Hostilities with the Japanese Empire have started. We are at war. Writing down something like that, how many times do we in our lives really have something that is that momentous, that meaningful? And of course, Pearl Harbor happens, 2,800 or so men are killed. Then fast forward to my job. I'm running Redken, so I'm captain of another ship. It's a hairdressing company, and underneath Redken, the subplot is Fifth Avenue, New York City. So everything we do had New York in it, the flavor, iconic images, taxi, and whatever. And on the 11th of September, I'm sitting in my office overlooking the Twin Towers, and I watched the whole thing happen right in front of my eyes. So everyone remembers their story. For me, there are two parts to this. One is that I'm running a company whose name has New York City in it. So this was really an attack on our city and the brand that I was running. And the second point is that outside of having a few friends killed, was that there are also 2,800 roughly people killed that same day. And so my first port of call when I was dealing with this is, what would my grandfather have done? How did he manage his situation? And I really made that parallel as I watched the whole thing happen in front of me in my office. So to remember that we have it good, to remember what are important values, that it's not about me, and what is your cause?
So, thank you for sharing that story as well. And so now, one of your points there was take away the me. And yet, this book is about us as individuals, right? In the subtitle, it says being yourself. So, you use the word being yourself. A lot of times people use the word being authentic. So, so first of all, let's talk about that paradox, right? Because I agree with you. Leadership isn't about us and, right? So let's talk about that paradox first. If a lesson for us is to take away making it about us, and yet it is about us, like talk about that paradox.
That's a good one. Right. Well, so the crux of the story is actually when you lead you need to know who you are. There is absolutely no good in trying to be authentic if you haven't done the hard work on figuring out who you are. And generally the issue is that we kind of rationalize this. We think we know it. We give ourselves some generalized ideas of who we are, which A, are too general, and not necessarily accurate. So the real crux of it is get to know who you are, what your weaknesses are, what your darker side might be, understand your emotions, understand how you're feeling. And if you understand who you are at that deeper level, you can feel what triggers you. You know when your heartbeat's going faster. Knowing you allows you to be better at the service of others, because you're not going to be needing to compensate for some chip on the shoulder or needing to humiliate somebody, because that's I have an issue with hierarchy. So it's really about knowing yourself better, and then you can sublimate yourself.
Yes.
Without feeling like you are useless or unnecessary. Of course you're necessary, but it's your feet are firmly planted on the ground because you know who you are. You got that stability to move forward together and keep the eye on the longer term ball.
Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we get unpack in there that I really love. I love this idea of sublimating yourself, but you can't do that, Mentor, to your point, until you have a real solid self-awareness, right? Is what I'm hearing you say. And I think you're exactly right. So now, thank you for that. Let's go back and unpack that word that, people that are watching or listening may say, well, people like Mentor and Kevin, those people use these words like authentic, right? So what does authentic leadership mean to you?
Well, first of all, I like to say that I try to avoid the tyranny of certain thoughts. So the tyranny of authentic leadership, or the tyranny of empathy, the tyranny of ethics, there's so of purpose, and know that there is no such thing as being perfectly authentic. First of all, you never fully know yourself. Second of all, one person might say, "Hey, Kevin, you really are authentic," and another person will say, "Oh, no, not never. He does. I don't like the way he rolls or whatever."
Yeah.
The notion of authenticity is something that's perceived, and you can't control that. So the only thing you can control is really understanding who you are, and being aware. Now, where this is tricky is that certainly we have to present an image. That's how you succeed in society. That's how you succeed in companies, and you play parts. And you can't just willy-nilly do things. You have certain contexts, like you have governance models. So you need to play this intelligently, but yet we intelligently tend to post-rationalize and kind of imagine we actually know ourselves better than we do. And I do a poll. I've done it to 10,000 people have answered this particular question, which is, how empathic do you think you are? And 73% of 10,000 people, 73% judge themselves to be either above average or well above average. 22% say that they're average, and the rest say that they're below average. So I don't know about you, but even in my literature classes, that doesn't sound like stacks up to statistics that are accurate. So we have an issue with self-awareness. And so one of my big messages is really dig in on figuring out who you are, including your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, things that trigger you, and your dark side, because we all have a dark side. And don't just brush them off. You need to embrace them all. That doesn't mean you're going to go out and proclaim, "Hey, this is Minter, the axe murderer. I'm not going to do that dark side." But I do need to be fully aware of it, because that's what makes up my corpus. And that's that these things come out in nonverbal communications. These things come out somehow, one way or another. So if you really want to be an authentic leader, you have to embrace that whole vision of you.
Yeah, I'm back on the 10,000 people and how empathic are you, right? And so I was thinking, yeah, do 77% of the people you interact with, do they seem to you to be above average or highly empathetic or empathic? And the answer is heck no, right? So we don't have to go much further. And it's a perfect example. And there's lots of research that says that we are not very self-aware, right? And what I think you're saying is we need to get on a path of being more so. And the book, we are talking with Minter Dial, the author of the new book, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And there's a lot in the book that talks about that specifically. But there's another phrase that you use that I'm guessing that and you've just hinted at it, but I'm guessing when you say this phrase, you get some looks and you get some concerns and you get some resistance. I'm just guessing. You can tell me if I'm wrong. And that phrase is, well, you really need to bring your whole self to work. I think you just told us what you mean by that. First of all, anything you'd add to that when I say that? If you give me that advice, Kevin, bring your whole self to work, what does that mean first? And then I'll ask my follow-up question.
All right. So the notion is you bring your whole self to work. It doesn't necessarily mean you show your whole self to work. You have to be pragmatic. There are times when you just have to suck it up. You have the CEO, your big boss comes in. You're not going to go dancing, wigging out to LSD because that's what you like to do. There's a context.
Good call.
Right? Exactly. So you need to be smart about it, but bring your whole self, understand your whole self. For example, how you slept the night before, of course, has an impact on who you are and how you feel when you're at work. If you had an argument with your spouse right before, of course, that's going to be in there. So you need to work through that. So the thing I would add is this, is I break down yourself into 3 parts: the professional you, the personal you, and then the private you. And I like to say that really everybody should have a secret garden, because I like to say that there is beauty in mystery. And it's okay. It's necessary. We all have our secrets. That's fine. Just be aware of them. Then, once you've cordoned that off, if you will, then you need to go into the personal space and understand who you are, what you stand for, and according to your comfort level, drive more from just the professional performing dude into this personal space where you include things like your real values, like your personal stories, your emotions, and understand that it's messy, but that's going to make you a much better leader when you know how to embrace this side of who you are, as opposed to just going after the bottom line every week.
Yeah, I really love because, well, so I'll ask this question then. So when you tell people before you unpack that idea, like you just did for us, or maybe even after you unpack what that means, what are the concerns that you hear when people say, well, yeah, mentor, but what are the things you hear? Because I'm guessing whatever you've heard is what some people are thinking right now as they're watching or listening. So I want you to sort of share what are the resistors? What are the concerns? What are the yes buts that you hear?
Well, that's dangerous because if I express my political opinions, that may go hairy. If I start talking about what I feel about my religion or a religion, so there are all sorts of zones that are tricky to deal with, and depending on the context and governance you have, you may or may not feel that's the right thing to do. So certainly there are other things like, oh well, I don't like myself. People don't like to admit that, but there is lots of that as well.
There's right, low self-image, low confidence, right?
And when that happens, then other things pop out, and those pops are not comfortable or good. There's one more thing I would say, which people don't usually say, but actually is that this takes time. First of all, it takes time to really do the work on who you are. So you can't just sort of, back of an envelope it. This is something that needs reflection, maybe some friends who can help you with stuff. And then the second thing is when it comes to having personal elements at work, it's sort of like having downtime. I'm going to tell you a story. Like Kevin, I spent maybe 2 minutes telling you a story. I wasted 2 minutes of your podcast to tell you a story. Yet these types of things connect. When you let the guard down, I could cry, or I could say, listen, Kevin, I'm not feeling so great. Oh, shit, he's going to moan on a bit. So these elements take time, whether it's listening to or just allowing for that space, that personal space. So we're not just on the efficiency bandwagon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm reflecting. Yeah, this is not something you're going to I'm listening to this on a Friday, and by Monday morning, I'll have this figured out. That's not the way this works. It's so interesting that you say what you just said, because yesterday I was asked to join a group of leaders who've been on a path studying and working through some things related to our book, The Long Distance Leader. And I've kind of gotten to know the person that's put that all together. I've chatted with her on the phone and on Zoom 2 or 3 times. And I got there early, as I would do, and some people started to arrive. And so she started, I think she knew she absolutely knew what she was doing, but she started asking me questions. She knew that I grew up on a farm. She asked me a couple of questions there. And I said, well, I can answer that question, but I might cry. She goes, that's okay. And and that was before we actually started, but there were a number of people there. And the way she started changed the way I interacted with the group for an hour and 40 minutes, which was almost twice as long as we'd agreed to. I believe, I hope, for the better for everybody. It was an incredibly enjoyable time for me, but I think was an incredibly meaningful time for the group, I believe. And it started because she prodded, she encouraged me to go to a slightly different place. I'm not afraid to go there, but I would not have necessarily gone there without her encouragement, right?
Yeah, well, in this
there's
case,
there's my 2-minute story, everybody.
That's it.
I should have said you could fast forward through this, everyone, if you'd like, but here we are. So there you have that. When we do this, when we work on ourselves so that we can bring more of ourselves, so we can be authentic, whatever words we want to use for that, how does that change our results?
Well, again, there's the element of context. So it's not always going to be a straight line. The first thing is you're going to feel better about yourself. You're going to feel more in touch with yourself. And there are great techniques for helping to do this. So it takes time, and there are tools and techniques. So it's not just some sort of vague plan. There, by the way, the other thing you need to remember is you're never going to have perfect knowledge. So just let go of that idea.
Please.
And how does it rumble? Well, I want to just bounce back on your story about how you ended up with this, talking about being on a farm and so on. One of the things we need in business and is so essential, especially when it comes to remote work, is this thing called trust.
Absolutely.
And the way you build trust is that it's on a personal level. I might trust you as a technician. I might trust you as a surgeon. But the other part is the hard part, which is trust you as a person.
Yep.
And
Common
that is deeply
purpose,
part.
motive.
That's it.
More than just competence, right?
Yeah. Your ethics. What do you stand for? And so there's this, I have a first time I really cried in public. I remember I was presenting something. I was very stressed, and I had this need to perform, and there was only 60 people, but it was 60 important people in the room, and it was a theater style in a very chic place, and we got into it, and then all of a sudden something happened, and I just couldn't hold back. It was just crazy. And so I was apologizing like mad. This is, I'm so sorry. This is not in character. I know you didn't come for this. And at one point, somebody started clapping.
Yeah.
Which a few other people did. And that allowed me some time to compose myself and come back into it. And at the end, I was still sort of looking at my shoes and groveling and thinking, oh, fucking hell, this is a disaster. I'm so sorry once again. And I got a very warm round of applause at the end. And then the key people in the room came up to me and embraced me. So the learning was they didn't think less of me.
No.
They connected more into me. Yeah. And for sure, we bonded. Because I allowed this, then they wanted to tell me their story. And then you have to have the willingness, the ear, and the time to want to hear their story, because stories beget stories. So if you're a great storyteller, you're going to make other people think about their times when they did or didn't cry. Yeah. And here I'm saying permission granted, not to cry every time. Hell, that's dogma again.
Right? Yeah, that's the tyranny, right?
Yeah, that's TEAR. A-N-N-Y.
Well done, master of 4 languages. Well done, my friend. So I have to say something. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm confident that you and I could have a very long conversation. I know we could. I wanted to connect back to one other thing you said that I think is so very important. I love about the book, and you talk about that there's 3 parts of us as individuals. There's the professional, the personal, and the private. And I think that one of the big things I will take from our time together is that, because so many people's challenges with the being authentic at work part is they lump personal and private together.
Exactly.
And if we can recognize that those 2 things are different, then I think that will help even the most hardened, if you want to use that word, professional, this is just work and nothing else. Even that, I think, will help to separate that for people to see that difference. And so I hope that all of you heard that. And that's why I wanted to kind of go back and sort of verbally underline it or highlight it for everybody. And Minter, you're nodding. So anything you want to add to that?
I think that is so true. And the little monkey brain says, well, I can't possibly talk about that. And yeah, maybe there are things you can't and shouldn't talk about, but it's not because you have that stuff that you can't bring more of your personality. That behind the personal is personality, and that charm and that trust will come through the personal stories, the real shit. And that's what people relate into. You're not going to moan and groan and cry all day long, but just allow yourself to be you, be in touch with your emotions, be in touch with what you're feeling. And that's also going to help you be in touch with emotions and feelings of others, have empathy with others.
You lead, being yourself makes you a better leader. And now you know more about that. And that's a great place for us to land the plane on sort of the main part of the podcast, Mentor. But I've got a couple other questions for you. First of all, like, what do you do for fun? Enough of that. Well, you hinted at it, I suppose, I hinted at it in the intro, but enough of this work stuff. I want the personal stuff. What do you do for fun?
Well, I love to write. I'm very creative. So I've written about 200 short stories. I've written one unpublished novel. I've written 19 songs, and there's nothing more pleasing than sitting down and playing, which I try to do pretty much every day, half an hour of my Taylor guitar, songs that I've written, or usually people who write better songs, like Mr. Robert Zimmerman, Bob Dylan, or Jerry Garcia, Robert Hunter, and Crosby, Stills,
Shocking
and
that you
Nash.
mentioned Jerry Garcia there. By the way, Taylor Guitar has been a client of ours for a number of years.
Oh, wow.
Everybody, for a connection. So I also know because we talked about this before I hit the record button, that you, like I, are a reader, reading lots of things at a time. So what's something or a couple things you're reading these days that people might find interesting, or that you might want to point people towards?
Right. So, I generally read about 4 or 5 books at a time, and I do it through different media, which is what the fun is. I have my audiobook, my Kindle book, my hardcover books. So I just listened to A Hitch in Hell, My Hitch in Hell by Lester Tenney, which is a gruesome story about his life and survival as a prisoner of war of the Japanese. It's an incredible story of survival and putting back perspective, much like the story I have on my grandfather, on what the hell we worry about these days. The other book is, and I'm just halfway through it, is called Grateful Dead and Philosophy. And it's a series of essays by tremendously interesting, well-researched deadheads who are writing about the philosophies. So it's embedded with all sorts of wonderful little stories, knickknacks. I've been to about 200 shows, so I feel part of that gang, and it's a really fun book to explore other types of philosophers, because the underlying philosophy of the Grateful Dead is really useful for people. Forget liking the band, but if you can embrace your death, the fact that we will die, it's so much easier to be present and to take advantage of the day and to have more fun, because life is short. And so being grateful comes in large part from embracing the fact that you know that there is an end.
There you go. Last question for you, sir. The one that you've probably been hoping I'd ask all along. Okay, where can we find the book? How do we connect with you? What do you want to tell us about where to point people before we finish this up?
Well, I'm hoping that you can find my book on some kind of sites. I think one begins with an A. But I also Amazon. Maybe bookshelf.org is a bookshop.org. Sorry, is an interesting site that supports independent booksellers. Otherwise, I have this googly friendly name, minterdial.com, where I write. I've been blogging since 2005, I think. And my podcast is also pretty usefully named Minter Dialogue, because I like to dialogue with people like you. And that's available on pretty much all the services. And and otherwise, I'm available on many social media under the handle MDIAL, MDial.
MDial. Mentors, before I thank you, I've got to ask a question of everybody else. I'm done asking you, but now I ask everybody else. Here's the question for you, everybody. Now what? There's plenty that you just got in the last approaching 35 minutes that you could apply. None of this will be more than a fleeting thought unless you take some action. What action will you take? Are you going to decide to dive in and try to become a little more self-aware? Are you going to think a little bit more about the blending of the personal and the professional? Are you going to think a little bit more about who are those folks that you've learned from and how you can lead from their lesson, but still be you? What is it that you take from our time? I just pick a few things, but the question is, what actions will you take as a result? Because if not, this was little more than Minter and I having a really good time together. So Minter, thanks so much for being here. It was such a pleasure. It was truly a pleasure.
Pleasure was all mine, Kevin. Thank you for having me on.
So everybody, before we go, this episode has been brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. Stay engaged and connected while working anywhere. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteammate.com. You can get an excerpt if you do that, because there's a big difference between working from home and being a member of a successful remote team. And with that, I will leave you, but I'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.